All right, we are back for yet another episode of movies. We're going to be talking about the first decade, or roughly first decade, of George Romero's career, beginning with Night of the Living Dead and closing out at Night Riders, the 1981 comedy drama starring Ed Harris about members of a Renaissance fair that live together. Cute little community. So now I'm going to be the only one on video?
Yep.
I don't think so. Back with us is Don Jolly. How are you doing today?
I am doing excellent. Thank you so much for having me back on the show. I'm very excited to talk about George Romero, one of my favorite filmmakers.
Yeah, it seemed we kind of went in that direction last time as we were talking about Japanese monster movies, kind of naturally guided into Night of the Living Dead zombie territory. And there is so much ground to cover as far as George Romero goes. Mm-hmm. We're going to start with Night of the Living Dead. We're going to get into everything else gradually. But I have to say, I actually revisited some of his newer movies before digging into the 70s catalog of film. Like the first one that I rewatched was Land of the Dead, which we're not really going to talk about this evening. But that was one I remember watching when it came out. And it didn't really connect with me, maybe because, I think I was probably like 14, 15 years old at the time. And I was really big on the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead remake. And 28 Days Later, like the faster zombies were more in. So that, for whatever reason, that didn't quite hold my patience upon its release. But I revisited it maybe about a week and a half ago. And it was so much better than I remembered. And I feel like enough time has passed with that movie as well, where it starts to feel more like an authentic member of that trilogy of films from night to day, whereas maybe it didn't exactly when it came out. What do you guys think of that movie, Land of the Dead?
I totally agree with you. I think that Land of the Dead only suffers by comparison with, Night, Dawn, Day, which is probably the best trilogy of horror movies that at least has come out of America. I mean, it's a series of like three absolute classics, and each one is like distinct from the others, So like Land of the Dead, I think suffers a little bit by having kind of that early 2000s, 70s revival grindhouse quality to it. But at the same time, I think that like the social commentary stuff that you have in there where like right now we're recording during the COVID-19 quarantine, like the rich are living essentially uninterrupted lives of leisure and pleasure, while the poor are, forced to go out into a virological wasteland in order to scavenge the supplies that they need to live. I think that was a pretty good metaphor. I think Dennis Hopper is great at it. I think John Leguizamo is really good. Asia Argento, whatever. But I think that Land of the Dead, I don't think it's the best of the trilogy, but I think it definitely belongs in the trilogy. I do not feel that way about like, Diary of the Dead or, the found footage movies that he did after that or, Land of the Dead is sort of the last hurrah, in my opinion. I do think it's time for a reappraisal of that film.
Hans, have you seen the later George Romero zombie films, Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, Survival of the Dead?
I remember that. Is Diary the found footage one?
It is, even though it's shot as if you would shoot any other movie with a budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only one that I kind of remember, and it's mostly because of that. They didn't really leave much of an impression on me for me to even tell you who's in it or what the plot's in it. I just remember the gimmick of it supposed to be that, but nothing about the movie at all. I agree with what Don was saying about the Land of the Dead, that's the last Romero movie that I actually enjoyed, that I can still think or remember without, rewatching it. But yeah, I don't remember them at all. So I guess that's how much I think about those two.
Oh, I remember them, but I remember them for like how lousy they are. And I mean, is it Survival of the Dead where they're on the island with the feuding families? Is that Survival?
I have yet to see that one, but I watched the trailer not long after checking out Land of the Dead. I felt like going back and rewatching all of the Dead films. I still have yet to watch it, but the trailer didn't didn't seem as bad as at least what I remember from Diary.
It's
of the
not.
Dead, which
It's not as bad as Diary. I don't think it's up there with Land. I just like it feels like towards the end of his career, like because there was that zombie revival that was, because of the Zack Snyder remake of Dawn of the Dead, which I don't want to step on any toes, but I hate that movie. 28 Days Later, which I think is also like, it is not to my taste, but it's 28 Days Later is like a legitimate flick. Like Danny Boyle was actually doing something with that, but because it was like this zombie thing and the Resident Evil movies were making money, he was actually supposed to do the first one of those, but it didn't work out. George Romero sort of ended his career pigeonholed as like a zombie director, which I don't think is fair. I think he created the modern zombie genre, but he did a lot of other things too, especially in the field of horror films. So hopefully we'll get to talk about some of that. Like I'm really anxious to talk about Martin, for instance.
I want to hear what you have to say about the Dawn of the Dead remake.
Yes, I would like to hear this as well.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Dawn of the Dead is an important movie to me, and I'll admit that the Dawn of the Dead remake is like, maybe it's well made, and I'm just not in a spot where I could see it because I'm so attached to the original. Like the thing that bothers me is, and I think that this is a constant pattern when you have like big Hollywood remakes of sort of like films that were made outside of the Hollywood system. Maybe whether we're talking about like the last episode, we were talking about Godzilla movies being made in the United States, where they're sort of like created and they're sort of shaped into the antithesis of the political message of the earlier Japanese films. Like Dawn of the Dead. Like if you ever watched the original trailer for the '78 Dawn of the Dead?
I have not.
Okay, so they literally say in the trailer, and I don't know if this is an exact quote, but it's something like this, a society gone mad. And it's showing all the people grabbing rings off of the zombie woman at the end. Like they put they show shots of the mall. They talk about, sort of the perils of consumerism, even in the trailer. Like the social commentary was not like this hidden thing in the original Dawn of the Dead, right? Like the fact that they're in a mall, that they're in this shopping complex, and that they're living this illusion of stability while the world goes to shit was like the thing that sold the movie. Like the theme was super important. And it's like, it's not a particularly subtle film in terms of like imparting that theme, but to me, the theme of the critique of consumer culture that is like so front and center, even in the advertising of Dawn of the Dead, and certainly in the film itself, like the social criticism is central to the movie, much more so than the gore and the zombies and the machetes and all of the like fun 70s grindhouse stuff, right? And I think this is true of Land of the Dead as well, where it's like all of these films, like the social commentary is front and fucking center. And when they did the remake, there's no social commentary in that film. They build a bus at the end with chainsaw holes so that they can fight zombies. A lot of it is about like the sort of procedural questions of like, how would you survive in a zombie apocalypse? And like, I just don't give a shit about that at all. And I also find it a little bit like that, because this isn't really the Dawn of the Dead remake that does this, but there's that whole industry that came out. Like Max Brooks wrote the Zombie Survival Guide. You see it sometimes on people's like dating profiles these days, even where they're like, "Here's what I do in a zombie apocalypse," which isn't. Get eaten.
That's the worst part.
But like they turned this critique of consumer culture in American society into an expression of consumer culture, where it was all about like, if I had the right gear, if I had the right stuff, like then I'd really be set, then I'd be great. And it's like, we are kind of living through a zombie apocalypse right now. So I'm wondering how much people think that their like, their consumer preparations have made them ready for the depression that we're all like moving up into. So that basically my critique of the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead remake is like, number one, I think it's bullshit that it's called Dawn of the Dead and that it's like a not socially conscious movie at all. And second, like if you held a gun to my head, I could not identify any character from that movie. I could tell you that Sarah Polley and Ving Rhames were in it. I could remember particular scenes. But like to me, it's a hollow picture, and all the best things about it are stolen from sort of better movies with more depth. I also think that that's true about 28 Days Later. I think 28 Days Later is basically like a fast motion remake of a bunch of different things. Like, the scenes of the deserted London, I think, owe a lot to Day of the Triffids, which is an excellent short story, also excellent movie. But there's when they get to the military base, then it's like Day of the Dead. It's like watching all of the Romero trilogy like in fast motion. But the thing about the kind of redeems 28 Days Later and does not affect the Dawn of the Dead remake at all is that 28 Days Later, they shot it all on those digital cameras. It's got like a very, well done, like well thought out aesthetic and look. And like, I get 28 Days Later. I will accept 28 Days Later, even though I don't think it's like, I don't think it's up there with the Dead trilogy or even like Return of the Living Dead or something like that in terms of like zombie pictures. But like, I'll accept it as like an artistic project with like a really well done aesthetic. And like, to the extent that the Dawn of the Dead remake has an aesthetic, it has 28 Days Later aesthetic, but like transported to the United States and with different color grading. So that's kind of my take on that.
I think that's a wholly valid opinion. And it sounds a lot like your problems with the Dawn of the Dead remake aren't dissimilar from what my problems were with Doctor Sleep, the sequel to The Shining.
Oh, God, yeah.
Which is just essentially just commercializing everything that was artistically great about something that came many years before and creating a bastardized version of that. I find 28 Days Later to be fairly overrated and kind of tonally inconsistent. I think the wind gets really sucked out of that movie as soon as they hit the military base, and it becomes a completely different film.
Yeah. Now,
Don,
did you see?
You got something to say?
Did you see Doctor Sleep, Don?
I did see Doctor Sleep. Yeah.
What do you think? I like asking people just because I feel like me and LOWRES really hated it, and most of the
everyone else is like, it's fine, it's good,
yeah.
I love it.
No, I do not love it. No, I saw it with a guy who was like, it's okay. I was super shocked that Red Letter Media liked it, by the way. Did you guys see that? Like, and they were saying, oh, it's like it's an old school kind of movie. And I'm like, in what fucking sense? I mean, here's my thing with Dr. Sleep, because like, I don't hate it 100% all the way through. Because I actually had read the book that it's based on, and there are moments of the movie that are pretty good adaptations of what I found to be like Stephen King's not my favorite writer. I don't think Dr. Sleep is a great book, but it's good enough. It's fine. It's got some decent character work. I like Danny Torrance in it. I like the whole thing about him going through AA, which is like a common Stephen King theme. And I like the kind of like hard scrabble redemption arc that he has in that picture or in that novel. And, there's parts of the movie that are a pretty good adaptation of that book. Right.
I'll tell you what, I was almost on board with the movie up until they do go to the Overlook and the whole ending is changed. Because I read the book as well. I wasn't a fan of the book. I didn't like the more fantastical elements that were inserted in Rose the Hat as a villain. I was never a fan of that character. I like the first 30-some-odd minutes of the movie, and I thought the idea of having Danny Torrance as a hospice worker helping patients pass over could have been great. In theory, I think it's a great follow-up idea. But it gradually decays, especially in the film version, where for all the reasons you're saying right now. I mean, we spent about 2 hours complaining about this movie on a podcast already, but it's insane what they try to do with this, and it's entirely, I think, because Warner Brothers had it in their head probably around 2015 or so that we're gonna mine The Shining next as our next big franchise. It is popular right now. And now you see that they had planned for a follow-up to Dr. Sleep if that had performed well. That would have been like Dick Halloran as Van Helsing in that whole world. And that didn't work out. So they're going to do a J.J. Abrams Overlook series instead, which is going to be a prequel. So the first movie we're going to be getting into is Night of the Living Dead. That is George Romero's first film. It's one of his films that maybe aged the best. Criterion recently put out a special Blu-ray release of it, restored it, and we were talking about how it's in the public domain, and anybody can tinker with that and release their own version. Hans, you got swindled into paying for Night of the Living Dead 3D starring Sid Haig.
Yes, I'm probably one of the few people that saw Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead before the original and Night of the Living Dead 3D before the original.
Oh my God.
No.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you survived that experience.
Oh.
I actually don't think that Night of the Living Dead 3D was because of the public domain thing, though. I think that was because, because the rights to Night of the Living Dead are split between George Romero and I believe his name is John Russo. And he's got like half of the franchise. So that's like his stake in Night of the Living Dead is the reason why in the 90s there were all those like weird, like I think specifically 3D was related to his ownership of the brand, but also Return of the Living Dead is an official sequel to Night of the Living Dead because Russo has that ownership.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever seen the color and the extended cut of Night of the Living Dead that was put out around the time of the 30th anniversary that John Russo had shepherded, where they went out and they filmed with like really bad local actors, more scenes to explain how the zombies came about. And there's a preacher that looks like Anton LaVey, and apparently he did like tracks for the extended cut. It's really rough. They're all on YouTube in a combined video that you can watch, and I think it's maybe about 25 minutes long if anybody is curious.
Yeah, no, I have not I have not taken the Russo pill. I have not dug into the Russo verse aside from Return of the Living Dead, which I think like everybody's pretty positively disposed towards that movie. But no, I haven't seen the colorized version or the extended version. I have heard that they are like ridiculously terrible.
Well,
yeah, they are.
They're
not worth anybody's time.
I'm looking at John Russo's IMDb, and there's another Night of the Living Dead that was so good that is directed by Alan Smithy. So I'm sure I'm sure that's a classic. And Escape of the Living Dead has been announced.
Escape of the Living Dead.
Yeah, there's no information at all. It just says that the last update was in May 2017, and it has 50% funding. But just by seeing that the last one of the Living Dead that he wrote was that another Night of the Living Dead, I can imagine that that's probably dead by now.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the franchise that just won't die because people get. There's a sequel to Day of the Dead, even like Day of the Dead Contagion. Yeah, have you guys seen that?
Yeah.
I haven't personally.
No. I remember being curious about that when I was just a young lad surfing the World Wide Web back in like 2006, 2007, and these kinds of movies would pop up, and there's so many like offshoots and remakes and sequels to these movies that they have like interesting advertising campaigns, and then you sit down and you watch them, and you can tell that there was like no care, no thought put into any of it. It was just a quick cash grab. Like the Day of the Dead remake that Steve Miner directed is one of the worst films I've ever seen in my entire life, and that has like a legitimate cast to it. That has Ving Rhames, that has some other actors, and it's putrid. It's really terrible.
Is it actually a remake of Day of the Dead? Is it like that storyline and shit?
No. It might as well be any other zombie film. It has very little to do with Day of the Dead or the themes of that movie. They essentially just used the name up to bolster DVD sales.
I would argue that they did a similar thing with the remake of Dawn of the Dead, but I mean, not to bolster DVD sales, because obviously that was a much better production, but it's like the name and kind of none of the rest of it, especially none of the thematics. But
to get back to Night of the Living Dead, though, where do you guys want to start in terms of discussing the film itself, as opposed to any of its sequels or ripoffs or
I guess I'm just
revised
a
editions.
little surprised as to how much of a hack John Russo is. I'm going through his entire filmography and everything looks like shit. Like it's not even that they're old, even the the 2000s, they still look like just terrible.
His talent on Night of the Living Dead was just being there.
Yeah.
He was in the right place at the right time, and he has milked that his entire career.
Like he happened to be, in the same area as a genius filmmaker, spinning in my opinion, Night of the Living Dead is the moment that horror movies become modern horror movies. You know what I mean? It's like you could talk about like the Hammer horror flicks and shit like that. I mean, there's some really cool horror movies that that are sort of like bracing experimental from the 60s, but like I feel like aside from the fact that it's in black and white, Night of the Living Dead feels totally contemporary in the way it treats its characters. In the sort of the absolute brilliant thing about it is that limited perspective on a global catastrophe, right? Like you don't actually see the cities full of the living dead. You hear about it in snatches on the television. It's so much creepier than if you had actually, like, you think about where the zombie genre kind of went, and it's like the story for Night of the Living Dead of this, like, all the dead have come back to life. It could have been fucking World War Z with Brad Pitt, where it's like, we need you to come out of retirement, Chief. Like, you gotta fly around on a helicopter. We've got these like massive sweeping crowd scenes of all the zombies. No, you don't need it. It's not scary. It's fucking bullshit. I mean, I haven't seen World War Z. I'm not interested, but you know what I'm saying? Like that expansive, God's eye view perspective of this disaster is not actually that scary. The genius of Night of the Living Dead is that you're stuck with those characters and you don't know what's going on any more than they do. And when you get those glimpses of it, it's just so, and this holds in Dawn of the Dead, this holds in Day of the Dead. It's that limited perspective that just really makes them unnerving, really well done films. And like, to me, Night of the Living Dead, it has aged so tremendously well. Like, even the fact that it's, it was in the public domain for a lot of years. A lot of times, like, I'd be watching Night of the Living Dead in sort of like suboptimal copies. Like, I've watched this with a lot of different people, and I think it's engaged every single group that I've watched it with. It's like people that would absolutely tune out if I tried to get them to watch Creature from the Black Lagoon or the incredibly strange creatures that stopped living and became mixed up zombies. Like, Night of the Living Dead works 100%. Any audience, anytime. I think it's a work of genius.
And it's kind of surprising that other filmmakers who are competent and have dabbled in that territory of horror they haven't grasped the fact that, for the reasons you're stating right now, that kind of intimacy, that personal nature to each of the Dead trilogy films is really what makes them work, I think, and brings them out to be their strongest. They always seem to be gearing toward this all-encompassing nature of, like, this, the world, the town, the city, etc. Is infested. We want to show this as much as we can, as opposed to it's just people trying to survive in one location and barricade themselves in there or avoid whatever terror lies outside the doorway.
Do you think that's because people just don't have patience for small stories like that, and which is why something like World War Z, which to me it's like a zombie show if CBS made it, but it made 540 million worldwide, as opposed to a smaller story from people that are trying to survive the thing, but not at a large scale, and like World War Z. I think it would be maybe a little bit more difficult for the regular public to just sit and watch that instead. Then again, didn't Cloverfield 2 do something similar to that?
Yeah,
I mean,
it did.
I'm sure they didn't. I mean, they didn't make as much money, obviously, as World War Z, but something like that. I don't know if it's just maybe the studios are scared of putting a smaller story like that. It's not going to be. You're not going to be able to get like a loud, wild trailer out of. as opposed to having a crowd of zombies trying to climb a wall and then taking down a helicopter or whatever the fuck happens in that shit.
Well, I think it has to do with I think that Night of the Living Dead and World War Z are like calling them both movies is actually kind of reductive because they're really doing very different things. Like Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Martin, like George Romero's movies are stories, and they're very heavy on theme. They're very heavy on social commentary. They've got really good, really full featured characters. Even like Creepshow, which is his horror anthology movie, it's like every character in that movie is so vivid, like so alive. You know, it just explodes off of the screen. These are stories, you know, stories told in cinematic form, but they're still like they are primarily stories, even if they are like they have these fantastical elements, these horror elements, whatever else. It's more of a theatrical thing, more of a storytelling experience. Then when you get to like blockbuster cinema, like post Star Wars cinema, like the thing is blockbuster movies are always going to make way more money than, you know, you know, just like an intimate story that's really focused on character and theme. And the reason is because they sell themselves entirely on like visual spectacle. And it's not that they don't have character and theme, but the character and theme are sort of like smoothed and rounded to the point where it's like everybody is going to have at least some connection to it. But it's not really about telling the story. It's about the story as a delivery mechanism for visual spectacle. So yeah, it's going to make a lot more money, but I don't think it's actually like the blockbuster audience, in my opinion, is not the audience for film. It's a different thing. Like, and Mike,
I think that's a great way of looking at it. And also now, you know, let's assume that the pandemic that we're in the middle of has, you know, repercussions that go long beyond that. I think theater chains are going to feel this for a while. That would breed an opportunity for these smaller films to maybe find an audience through something like a streaming platform. So I don't think that the day that these types of movies maybe don't have a place is upon us.
No.
But I certainly think that moving forward, the theater is going to be reserved for those World War Z style epics. And I think categorizing that as a different thing than, you know, film or what have you in general, like Don is doing right now, is a good way of looking at it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would wonder, because the thing is, the blockbuster business is all based on like you make a ton of money really quick, but it doesn't last. You know, like I mean, Star Wars lasted, but like we've seen, you know, all it took was 3 lousy or 4 lousy. I can't remember, but like, you know, however many shitty Disney Star Wars movies they made, and suddenly the merchandise sales are in the toilet because nobody fucking cares anymore. You know, like. The Marvel movies and stuff, it's like, yeah, there's a huge merchandising empire related to that, but like there was a huge merchandising empire before the movies came around. My suspicion, I don't know if it's 100% borne out, is these blockbuster movies, the way that they make them today, they're never going to last as long as Night of the Living Dead. You know, like look at how powerful Night of the Living Dead is, because yeah, it's a shitty, you know, low budget black and white movie, right? John Russo has made his career off of just being around when they shot it. Like, that's a lot of suction for a little black and white movie. Like, it's got longevity. How many people are going to remember World War Z in 10 years? How many people remember Avatar now? Like, yeah, it made a ton of money when it came out. It was the most successful movie of all time when it came out. But
Thank you. I got into a giant argument for 10 hours with a member in our collective about Avatar, and someone trying to make the argument, the claim that Avatar is still culturally relevant to this day, and it's not. It's completely forgotten. Nobody watches that movie. Nobody cares about that movie. It was meaningless.
I was
you haven't seen it?
I read something about how if you don't see it in the theater, there's really no point, and I missed it.
Correct.
So I was like,
in 2009.
Yeah, and I missed it, so I was like, all right, then I don't care. And what happened to the 7 sequels that they were planning, or however many there were?
They're still in
still going. They
production,
just paused.
apparently.
Yeah.
Who knows? I was in a late night. I was getting a falafel. I was at a fucking Middle Eastern restaurant in the middle of the night. I look up on the TV and I'm like, I've been up for a while. I'm a little bit high, and I see these blue creatures like running around with robots and shit. I watched it for 15 minutes before I realized it was Avatar. I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, what the fuck? This movie looks so fucking weird. Jesus Christ, how do I not know about this? And I was like, oh, it's Avatar. Oh, right. It was the biggest movie of all time, fucking 8 years ago. Now I don't even remember the blue people. That's how bad it is.
Yeah.
It's just gone out of my head.
I think that's the ideal viewing experience, is sitting down at a falafel place under the influence, watching Avatar
with
on
no
television.
sound.
Yeah,
no
watching
sound.
Avatar
With
with no sound on a television. Yeah.
What you were talking about, blockbusters just not really delving into small stories. Something like that happened to me with the Megalodon movie that came out a couple of years ago. Because I remember reading that book a long time ago, and it was good. It was really good, and I was excited when they announced that they were going to make a Meg movie, because I thought they were going to take it serious. I thought they were going to do a Jaws-like thing, and then it was just Jason Statham punching a giant shark, and I was very disappointed. So I completely agree with what you said about how blockbusters don't really need to be deep at all. It's just how can we sell this trailer, and the story doesn't really matter. It just has to be really loud and show a lot of CGI thing, and that's it.
I would make the argument that at this point it's almost unrealistic to have any hopes for a blockbuster to have lasting value or some kind of creative integrity or intelligence to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different thing. It's like there could be good blockbusters or bad blockbusters, but like at least where I'm at in my life right now, it's like the blockbuster as I see it is like, okay, so people used to make this argument all the time where they'd say like, oh man, look at how popular this kitten video is. Like the internet's making everybody stupid. And I'm like, well, that's not necessarily true. It's just that like a 13-second video of a cute kitten is something that no matter how stupid or smart you are, that's an enjoyable little piece of candy. And so of course it's got like billions of views, right? Like it doesn't say anything about the people consuming it. It just says that like we've created this thing that's like broadly acceptable to millions of people. And that's what the blockbuster is. That's what the Marvel movies are. Is like we've created a product that is broadly acceptable to you and your grandma and your kid brother, and you can all go and like have a collective experience when you watch it at the theater. I mean, I think when the theaters are coming back, because like I know I have a friend in the theater business, and like they're talking about reopening in July or whatever, but like I don't know. Are people really going to want to go to the theater when the theater is like a vector of disease, which it like always has been?
I don't think so. I really think this is probably going to be it. This is what's going to push things over the edge, because a lot of people have been talking for a while. Oh, the theater chains are dying, slowly dying. I think you're going to see a lot of the smaller ones just gone. I know that there's tons of revival theaters that we're probably just getting by from the local Boston area and probably around here in New York that are relying on donations at this point to hopefully stay open. I don't know. I don't know if there's really much of an environment for that in today's landscape.
Well, I think before when you go to those multiplexes and you sit in one of those very cushiony seats, those seats are disgusting. But now they're disgusting and they can kill you. So I don't know. I don't know if you want to take that risk to watch another fucking Ant-Man movie. It's not really worth going. I'm looking at the list of blockbusters from last year, which is the last year when we actually had them, and there's not one that I would think I would want to watch in 5 years. There's Avengers, Lion King, Star Wars, Spider-Man, Toy Story 4, Frozen 2, Captain Marvel, Fast and the Furious.
They're all from the same company. But I think the thing that's also important to keep in mind when we're talking about these older films is that many of the blockbusters of the 70s and 60s and probably 80s weren't even intended to be as big as they wound up becoming.
Yeah.
Right? Unlike the films you're talking about right now, which are conveyor belt products from the Disney line.
See, that's the thing that's interesting about Star Wars, which is like, I mean, you could talk about Jaws, being like the first blockbuster, but Jaws is like, it's just a well-made monster movie, right? Star Wars, there's an alternate reality where Star Wars is just like a funky space movie that like weirdos like, and that there are no sequels. It just like it came out and people were like, oh, that's fucking weird, and that the fact that it became this like massive success. It's like the entire movie industry has just sort of been rejiggered into like, how do I make Star Wars? It's like this very weird thing where people are just like trying to dissect a work of art and like make it work for them. Like Avatar is very clearly James Cameron saying like, this is my Star Wars. You know what I mean?
Fucking terrible. I'm looking at blockbusters from the 80s, and even something like Terminator has more depth than anything that came out last year and comparable blockbuster like. And that's just like I guess sci-fi action movie that's not supposed to be very deep or smart, but it has a lot of more emotion and it drags you in a lot more than something like a Detective Pikachu,
I mean, there was a Terminator movie that came out last year. I think I even saw it. I don't know if I can remember fucking anything.
All I know about that movie is that they got Edward Furlong to show up for a quick motion capture before killing off John Connor in like the first 10 minutes. I remember there being headlines like Edward Furlong is coming back to the Terminator franchise. And it was literally just for this little moment where he dies right away, where he doesn't act at all. He's just standing there and then probably dies.
Oh, that's terrible. I mean, but like Terminator's another one where it's like, it's not a huge budget movie. It's relatively limited in scope. I mean, you do see a little bit of the future war, but mostly you just hear about the future war, Like like Night of the Living Dead, like Dawn of the Dead. It's got this, like Dawn of the Dead is much more expansive than Night, but it's a little movie that could. And it's like, it mostly is interesting on the level of like the characters and the world seen from their point of view. It feels much bigger than it actually is. Like you feel like you get this much more complete experience than what you're actually seeing on screen, And that takes us back to Night of the Living Dead, because that's what it's all about, is like, it feels like the end of the world, but mostly you're just seeing like a farmhouse and a cemetery.
Now, this movie was very successful. It did launch George Romero's career. And the thing that he followed it up with was a romantic comedy, which, Hans, I know you spent your time watching this and the film that followed it. There's Always Vanilla. John A. Russo is the producer of this movie as well. Hans, what did you make of this $70,000 rom-com that has nothing to do with Night of the Living Dead?
It's definitely, it feels like an experimental movie because there's a lot of parts in the movie when we're interviewing the main character and he's talking directly to camera, but then he acts normally like a regular actor in the rest of the movie. So it feels a little bit experimental, but that doesn't really take away from the fact that it's really dull and just a chore to get through. He got this guy that kind of looks like a less charming Mark Duplass that I think is in a lot of his movies. I don't remember what his name is, but I just couldn't. He didn't really do much for me, and the entire movie is just following him to the point where we see him talking straight to camera. But there's a thing of just constant music playing in the background too, which makes it feel a little bit experimental. But it's kind of just it feels long, and the comedy doesn't really hit. Like, I understand that it's a romantic comedy, so you're not supposed to laugh out loud, but not even like nothing. And that happens to me a lot with older movies where I just don't feel like the humor holds up most of the time. But in this one, I just didn't think there was any. The only thing that made me laugh was that when the guy was courting the main actress, he called her fat, and even though she's a model, and so he started like nagging her like that in a very obvious pickup artist way from modern day. So that made me chuckle a little bit, but it is kind of a chore to get through. I wouldn't really recommend any Romero fans to watch it unless you're a completionist that just wants to watch everything.
Sure. So there's two interesting things here, right? The fact that he went on to make this film probably means that he didn't consider himself, and probably even as he finished out his career with Survival of the Dead, probably didn't consider himself a horror director, even though that's what he would become known for, and that would be the majority of his output. For him to jump into a genre like this, and not only do this movie, but then also do the follow-up film, Season of the Witch, which would come out essentially as like a Russ Meyer style film. It was advertised as softcore porn under the name Hungry Wives, which is another one you decided to give your time to, Hans. But it seems like that he always had the zombie genre to fall back on. So it makes me curious if Dawn of the Dead was something he conjured up out of necessity, maybe. I don't know enough about the creation of that film. Don, maybe you do, but...
I know a little bit about the making of Dawn of the Dead. I mean, Dawn of the Dead is one of these things. I do think that there's an element of truth to, like... I don't think George Romero wanted to be a horror filmmaker. Like, I don't think he ever really saw himself as, like, a genre guy, you know? Like, he's not a... He's not, like, obsessed with putting... He's not, like Rob Zombie. That's a good way to put it. He's not, like, a horror fan who makes horror movies. You know what I mean? Right. I mean, I don't think he, like, specifically dislikes horror movies, but I think that, you know, he's just... He sees himself as being capable of a lot more, and he is. But Dawn of the Dead was something where it's like he had to get funding from Italy. The reason it's set in a mall is that he knew a guy who had a mall, and they were able to film at night. It was just this tremendous, like, because Dawn of the Dead has like a really big scope, right? But it was because Night of the Living Dead was so successful, he was able to get enough investors together to make this sort of like, you know, guerrilla style, you know, blockbuster epic zombie movie. And I do think that he was very invested in it. I don't think it was like a thing where he was like, oh, well, shit, back to this, you know? Because it's like, if he had really been like that, then he would have made a cheapo John Russo style Night of the Living Dead 2, right? And Dawn of the Dead...
Maybe.
Dawn of the Dead is not that movie.
Right. I would say that George Romero has... Well, we know that he's clearly the creative brain out of these two guys. But I'll give you a comparison, maybe, which is Nicholas Winding Refn winds up having to face bankruptcy after a movie called Fear X, and his instinct was, okay, well, I'm gonna go back to my film that created my career. I'm gonna go to Pusher, and I'm gonna do Pusher 2 and Pusher 3 so I can hopefully make the money back. And it was kind of do or die for him. But that didn't mean that he didn't have any personal or emotional investment in the product he was making. It just was that extra element on the line for him where if this fails, then, you know, he's probably picking up a handheld camera and getting a job at, you know, Stop and Shop or something.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do think that there's an aspect of that, you know, for sure. Because, like, what is, after Season of the Witch, is it Dawn of the Dead or is it The Crazies first?
The Crazies comes out the same year as Season of the Witch.
Okay, yeah. Because The Crazies even is like, to me, The Crazies is like a dress rehearsal for Dawn of the Dead in a lot of ways. Because it's a very different movie than Night of the Living Dead. It's got more of a, you know, more of a militaristic vibe to it. It's also a very similar movie because, you know, Hans and I were talking before the show, and it's basically got the same ending, right? I mean, spoilers for The Crazies, if anybody cares.
Yeah. 30 years.
But like, what did you guys think of? What did you guys think of The Crazies? Because it's like I always kind of saw it as, you know, the dress rehearsal version of Dawn of the Dead, or like the interstitial point between Night and Dawn.
It does feel like a checkpoint between those two films, or like a merger of the two. Before we fully dive into The Crazies, real quick though, Hans, because you did watch Season of the Witch, do you think there's anything of note to mention about that before we talk about the subsequent film?
I don't know. I was trying to figure out the softcore approach because the sex scenes that they show in the movie are very, like, even to that time, even to the 70s, they're very, very mild. So I don't know if maybe the softcore that I grew up with, it's way more modern or more showy, I guess,
Well,
than
you're
that.
like 40. You're pushing middle age now.
Because
Hans. I mean,
because like the one scene that stuck in my head was when they're just kind of, I guess, having sex in the carpet, and then she's completely covered by a towel under him, which is a weird thing to have while you're laying on the ground with the carpet. So the fact that it was sold as a softcore porn first before they released it as Season of the Witch was really peculiar to me, especially because it does kind of look like a porno movie. There's not a lot of outdoors in it. A lot of it happens inside, so it feels very claustrophobic. It feels like she's inside of like a cage, but it's just all over the place. So it's not very consistent tonally, and then at the end, the conflicts gets resolved really easily and very quickly. She spoilers, another movie that came out fucking 35 years ago. She kills her husband at the end in a very sloppy, very look at what happened way, and then she just gets away with it because she's a witch. And it's just very, I don't know. It didn't do it for me. Same with There's Always Vanilla. Like I felt like I wasted.
which one was better?
Season of the Witch, just because visually it's a little bit more interesting, but they're both not very good.
And you got into the Crazies as well.
Yeah, I watched the Crazies, and I feel like it's one of those movies where I don't know if it was Romero that had not figured it out, but the action feels very sloppy. Feels very theater like, where someone gets shot and then they jump 20 feet in the air and like move their arms, and it's just very not unrealistic, I guess. I don't know if it's because now we've been exposed to so many even real videos of people getting shot where it just looks kind of odd, but the action in that movie kind of took me out of it a little bit at first, and then the ending was just very I couldn't get into it at all. I get what Don says about the Dawn of the Dead thing, but this definitely nowhere near as good as Dawn of the Dead.
Right. And this is the first movie in his filmography where you start to notice some faces that will come up later on. He has like a good band of actors within that Pittsburgh area that he winds up reutilizing. We have at least one cast member of Day of the Dead in here. And then before the show, Don, you had mentioned the man with the eye patch at the beginning of Dawn of the Dead, who's on the television having a debate with somebody. He has a prominent role in this film as well.
Yeah, he's like a government scientist in the Crazy.
He's great.
Oh yeah, he's fantastic. The like big fat guy with the beard, who is, I think his big quotable quote is in Dawn of the Dead. He's the one who says we need to drop nuclear bombs on all the big cities. It's the only way. It's that or the end.
Mm.
That's I love that guy. He's like he's a big B movie ham, but he's fantastic, and he's so good in Dawn of the Dead. I mean, Dawn of the Dead. When Hans, you were talking about the action in the Crazies, it's like if you look at the way that sort of the kills and stuff in the Crazies are executed versus Dawn of the Dead. I feel like you see so much development there and so much like perfecting, because like pretty much every kill in Dawn of the Dead is like a classic, 100%, quoted, referenced, kill in cinema. Like, the zombie getting his head chopped off by the helicopter, the headshot where it's like that giant entry wound, like
the guts,
and the guts. Oh my God. I mean, Tom Savini, who did special effects for Dawn of the Dead, that was his first. Did he do special effects on the Crazies? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Yeah.
I think Dawn of the Dead might have been his first go around for that.
But he Dawn of the Dead is like a very comic booky kind of, this is 1978, like not to move on too quick from the Crazies, but like it's a very comic booky kind of heightened reality thing. But like, even if it's not necessarily convincing or like realistic, quote unquote, because I don't think anybody would say that about Dawn of the Dead. It's like you're never bored watching it. It's always absorbing. It's always fascinating. It's sometimes stomach turning. Like I'm fascinated by the special effects and the way that they approach action in that movie, and it's so much more effective than the Crazies.
And Dawn of the Dead winds up coming out at the same time, or the same year rather, as Martin, which is a much smaller film by comparison. I cited it on the last show as my favorite Romero film.
Yeah,
it still holds that title.
Yeah, and it's my favorite as well.
John Amplas as Martin is excellent. But Hans, you took a nap during this movie. You fell asleep.
Yeah,
you were dozing off. Why?
I have an issue of laying down and watching movies. I'm too old, I guess. I don't have enough energy when I keep dozing off.
You could sit through Season of the Witch, and there's always vanilla. You couldn't sit through Martin.
I didn't finish it. I couldn't finish it, and then I just didn't have enough time. I didn't get deep enough to exactly know what was going on completely. So I'll just let you guys talk about it, and I'm sure I'll watch it later.
Well, Martin is about an adopted boy who's searching for his real father, and I know it. Don, do you want to give a good summary of Martin?
Ah, geez. Okay, so Martin is about a vampire who may or may not be a vampire. It's a boy who's living with his. He's an adopted boy. He's living with his. Sort of adopted family who believe him to be this, satanic vampire figure. He has memories, or maybe they're hallucinations, of living in different times of history that are all sort of like shot with the deliberate, in my opinion, chintziness. Like they have a lot of fog machine. They're actually done in like sepia tone. And, Martin himself, like when he sucks blood, he doesn't have the fangs. He's not like, a traditional Count Dracula style vampire. He opens people's veins. He drugs them, opens their veins with a razor blade, and then injects the blood like a heroin addict. And sort of the whole thing is about this question of identity at the core of that character. And like, to what degree, like, he is a vampire, he's actually sucking blood. Does it matter if this is something that's put on him culturally, or if this is something that's like a biological imperative? As William James says in The Varieties of Religious Experience, our material experience of the world is a island floating in a sea of immaterial abstracts. And I think that Martin is ultimately about the tension between how much we are shaped by our idea of ourselves versus how much we are shaped by, biological reality or material reality. And I think that it's a fucking fascinating movie. I think that every performance in it is fantastic. I especially appreciate Martin's religious uncle. I think it's an uncle.
Oh, no. It's his cousin. His cousin is like 75 years old. Martin is, at the time of shooting, John Amplas was only 29. But I think they want you to believe that Martin is maybe in his early 20s or like late teens, and he certainly has that look to him.
Yeah, but his cousin is 75 years old.
Right.
He's also an immortal vampire, potentially.
There's something about like the family bloodline where, he has a second cousin who lives with the older cousin who's a girl, and she's dating Tom Savini in the film. And Tom Savini wants to ditch the town and take her with him, but the cousin is, he's very against this because he doesn't want his bloodline continuing because he fears for more Martins, more vampires coming up.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting film. If anybody has seen, the TV show Dexter, it's kind of got a similar approach to that with vampirism and made so much better. Than that. So, yeah, but Hans, what was your problem with Martin where it just couldn't hold your attention?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. It felt very claustrophobic, and there was a lot of close-ups, which I didn't really mind that much. I guess it's a little bit odd because it's not something that you're used to, I guess, with modern movies. But I don't know. It's not that I didn't like it. I just didn't get into the story, and then I passed out. So I don't really have much against it. I had a couple of notes here that I wrote. That one of them was just that if you were a murderer in the 70s, life was awesome because no one could catch you. And I feel like that is shown in this movie. I don't know if he gets caught at the end or not, but I remember thinking that
Yes,
while seeing it.
they
But
slap him in handcuffs. He goes to the county jail, and that's the end of Martin. You just see bars in front of his face, and he's holding them and frowning, and then they roll the credits. No, this movie has one of the best endings of any movie, in my opinion, which is that regardless of whether or not Martin is a genuine vampire or not, he's goaded his older cousin, his senile cousin, on one too many times. There's actually a scene where he's like teasing him, kind of, where he puts fangs in his mouth, he gets a cape, and they bring out that fog machine, and he's like chasing him around a little bit, and he falls down on like a what's the thing I'm thinking of at the playground that twirls, that spins.
Oh,
it's a very like 1950s playground sort of device.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the name of it. It's like it's like a spinner. I don't know.
Sure, yes. We'll just call it a spinner. It's unimportant. But, he just pushes his cousin a little too far that one time. And then the cousin comes back with like an exorcist, and Martin runs off during that. But the movie ends with his cousin, who fully believes he's a vampire, reminds him at every turn that Martin is a vampire, that he's Nosferatu, staking him in the chest abruptly because he thinks that Martin is responsible for the suicide of this older woman that he's been sleeping with, when in actuality she was just depressed in an unhappy marriage and she cut her own wrists.
okay.
It's a very like abrupt, completely unexpected turn of events for the story, because you just think, all right, well, that happened. Martin seems to have gotten over it rather quickly. He's out hanging out in the parade alongside all the dancers and singers and whatnot. And then we cut over to that, and it's like, of course, this is how it ends. In retrospect, it's the only way it really could.
Yeah, 100%. Because it can't, it's not really that interested in whether or not Martin is actually a vampire. It's interested in like how that belief impacts his character and how it works in the mind of his cousin. It's also kind of like, as you're describing it here, it's kind of an anti-exorcist movie. You know what I mean? Because it's like in The Exorcist, the whole thing is about like these, rational people having to come to accept this sort of old world, irrational, spiritual explanation for things. And it's about the deliverance of the exorcist and stuff like that. Whereas here, the old world is sort of, it is definitely a thing that has like ultimately it ruins Martin's life, the way that his family perceives him. And it's something that is much more, this sort of old superstition is something that's much more insidious and something that's much more difficult to confront than it is in Friedkin's, Exorcist.
Absolutely. And George Romero does play a priest in this film, it should be noted, who really doesn't seem to take anything that the cousin says seriously. He kind of pawns off that older priest onto him, so he doesn't have to perform any kind of exorcism. Yeah, and it's just an interesting contrast that this is the type of movie that would come out within the same year of Dawn of the Dead, which is just, in many ways, like an antithesis to it.
Yeah, I mean, Dawn of the Dead is like big, like exuberant, actiony kind of. The way George Romero always described it is like as a comic book. It's like a comic book of a movie. Not to say that it's like a Marvel movie or something where it's like based on a comic book, but it's got that kind of like heightened reality to it. And I mean, am I wrong in saying that this is probably like the most popular and influential of his movies? Like in general, like Dawn of the Dead is the one that like gets the most cultural play. I mean, maybe Night of the Living Dead.
I think that would probably be correct.
And, that also, like, Dawn of the Dead also spun off a whole series of Lucio Fulci, Italian follow-ups, like, because it was Zombie when it was released in Italy, and then there's, like, Zombie 2, Zombie 3, Zombie 4. Like, all those Fulci zombie movies are, like, technically branches off of Dawn of the Dead.
Have you guys seen any of those? I have not seen the the Argento cut of Dawn of the Dead, but I hear it just removes all of the humor, and he has more control of the soundtrack.
Yeah, I mean I've seen the Argento cut of Dawn of the Dead, and it's because there's a bunch of different versions of this movie. Have you guys seen the director's cut, by the way?
No, I don't think so.
So it's like an extended version that was played at European film festivals. And actually, George Romero did do the cuts for the theatrical version. I still think that the best version of the movie is the theatrical. The Argento version is interesting by contrast. The director's cut basically, like, there's a lot more before they actually go to the mall. There's a lot of like scenes that feel very quick in the theatrical version that are actually a little bit fuller. I don't know if it's not like a bad change, but it's like, it's interesting, but it's maybe not as effective. I do think definitely if it had been the director's cut that had been released, and it's actually kind of wrong to say director's cut because that implies somebody other than the director did the theatrical cut, which isn't true. But that earlier cut, that longer cut, I think if that had been the one that was released, the movie probably wouldn't have the reputation that it does because it turns it into a much slower burn, kind of a little bit more like Night of the Living Dead in terms of the pacing. Whereas, when the theatrical cut, Dawn of the Dead is like very action focused, and it's like there's all kinds of you feel like you're always going from like set piece to set piece to set piece to set piece in that movie. And that kind of gets slowed down a little bit in the earlier version.
Out of curiosity, what was you guys' introduction to George Romero? Because this was loosely it for me. I remember being like 8 or 9 years old and always skimming eBay to try to find a VHS copy of Dawn of the Dead, and it was impossible to find a copy back then. And it's still pretty rare now to get like a good a Blu-ray or what have you of Dawn of the Dead, for whatever reason. But I remember always trying to find that, and then eventually I came across Night of the Living Dead when I realized those were connected, and I checked that out and became aware of the Dead trilogy. I don't think I saw this movie until it got remastered for DVD, maybe in like 2003, 2004. And I remember it not being entirely what I had hyped it up to be in my mind at that point, but now as an adult man, I think looking over the entire Dead trilogy and then Land of the Dead and, the two that came after, which we won't even talk about, I think it's probably the most well-rounded of those films and maybe the most well-rounded Romero film that isn't like an intimate, personal film like Martin.
Yeah. What was my introduction? I guess this was like 2001 or 2002. I was starting to get into horror movies, and I got a VHS of Dawn of the Dead off of Amazon. I got Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead. My copy of Dawn of the Dead, my VHS copy, was signed by George Romero, but it's I think it's lost in a warehouse in New York somewhere. So sadly, I've lost track of that. But I still have the copy of the Day of the Dead, weirdly. And I just remember that Dawn of the Dead, like, I don't know what I knew at that point. I mean, I guess at the time I was pretty active, like, figuring out what my movie purchases were going to be by, like, researching shit online. I had seen Night of the Living Dead. I had seen Night of the Living Dead when I was a kid, just, like, renting it out of Vulcan Video down here in Austin. But I just remember when Dawn of the Dead came in and when I watched it, it was one of those movies that just like slapped me in the fucking face. And it's like, you ever have this experience where you watch a movie and then you take it out and you rewind it and you watch it again immediately? Dawn of the Dead was that for me. And I probably watched Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, or Night of the Living Dead, like once a week, all the way through high school, all the way through senior year of high school. I mean, Dawn of the Dead was like the thing that I would put on when I got home from school. It was like, there was no mood that I was not ready to watch Dawn of the Dead in.
My introduction was the aforementioned Night of the Living Dead 3D and sex.
That's not a Romero film.
I think, well, what happened with me purchasing that movie was that when I was living in Toronto. This was what, 2003, 2004. There's this theater, or I don't know if it still exists. It used to be called Bloor Cinema, and they would just play. It was like an independent movie that would just play old movies. And I remember that being announced, and then I saw the movie at a video store. So then I thought, well, it's in 3D, so it has to be better. And then it wasn't. It really, really, really wasn't. But then that's what got me interested into actually looking up who the original creator was, and also with Dawn of the Dead, because I knew that it was a remake, so I was interested in just watching what the original was. Now, something that I want to mention about what Don said regarding Dawn being maybe the biggest movie or the most recognized movie that whenever you mention George Romero, do you think that's because of the I don't know, revival? I don't know if you can call it revival, a zombie revival that happened in the early 2000s when Dawn of the Dead came out. Because I remember that it for the time, I think it made about 100 million in the theater, and then after that, or I don't know if that's the one that started it, but then, you know, those 2000s that craze for zombies, that everyone was just making zombie movies. Was that the one that started it all, or is there another one that was bigger than the remake of Dawn of the Dead?
I mean, I think that the thing that started the zombie revival was 28 Days Later. And like 28 Days Later was the thing that really got everybody going making zombie movies. Because like, you know, zombie movies, like the 28 Days Later maybe was the thing that made it a genre too. Like, as opposed to some cool movies. Because like Return of the Living Dead, Lucio Fulci's Zombie, Dawn of the Dead, you know, or like Shockwaves with Peter Cushing with the Nazi zombies that choke people to death. Like, or White Zombie with Bela Lugosi. Like, they all have zombies in them, but like they're very different movies. Like, even Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead are very different movies, you know? Like, the zombies look really different. You know, there's a different setup every time. Return of the Living Dead, even like the rules are different for zombies. And like, you know, because in the Return of the Living Dead series, obviously you could like chop them up and their hands still move around. They eat brains. They don't just eat people. Like, you know, the zombie movies were like very plastic, very changeable up until 28 Days Later, I think, which is like, even though that's one where it's like, yeah, it invented its own rules, you know, the rage virus, like it had that virological angle. Like, there's a lot of things about 28 Days Later that like make it kind of a new spin on the genre. But for whatever reason, that's when zombies started to be like a genre where there's like a certain set of rules, you know. It's like, and that's all back from Romero. Like, everybody goes to Dawn of the Dead, I think, is like the platonic ideal of a zombie movie, right down to the fact that it's like, you notice that it's like the Night of the Living Dead style social commentary where it's about like simmering racial tensions is not as prominent in stuff like, you know, Zombieland or whatever than this sort of flippant critique of consumer culture and shit, which I think is like, that all comes out of Dawn of the Dead, right? Like, Dawn of the Dead is the movie that for whatever reason just like set everybody else, like it inspired so many imitators, you know, like, and so many references and so much like cultural activity that it kind of became the like the wellspring of the modern zombie whatever, you know. Much more so, I would argue, than Night of the Living Dead, which is more of a like, even though Night of the Living Dead sets up like the rules of the zombie genre and whatever, I would say that like Dawn of the Dead, with its expanded scope and like the post-apocalyptic bikers, like that's kind of the text for pretty much every other, you know, especially like the 2000s, like zombie revival kind of movies, right? I think they all go back to Dawn of the Dead. Yeah. I mean, and it's also like, it's just my favorite weird thing that came out of Dawn of the Dead. There is actually a Japanese typing game, like a typing tutor.
Oh, yes.
That is it's not Typing of the Dead, where it's House of the Dead remade.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's a Japanese learn English game where you just type the lines for the entirety of Dawn of the Dead over and over again in English. Like, my point is that, like, Dawn of the Dead is a movie that, for whatever reason, like, it's kicking in Italy, it's kicking in Japan. Obviously, Quentin Tarantino loves it, or he wouldn't have, like, done 90% of the things he did in Dusk Till Dawn. You know, obviously the Simpsons loves it because they've got that zombie episode of Treehouse of Horror, which I think is very Dawn of the Dead with a little Return of the Living Dead mixed in. I also think that's why, you know, it's kind of become cultural shorthand that zombies eat brains, because they ate brains on The Simpsons. Really, the only other time they eat brains is in Return of the Living Dead. But yeah, I think Dawn of the Dead, for whatever reason, and I don't know exactly what it is, but it just, like, crosses barriers and it entertains fucking everybody. And I think it's, you know, had a tremendous impact for that reason.
Hans, do you have a preference of the Dead trilogy?
Yeah, I guess Dawn. Night of the Living Dead. I mean, it looked great compared to the 3D when I first watched it, just because the 3D is such a pile of shit. But the story, the fact that it's bigger, the fact that the characters are more animated, the fact that it has more action in it than Night of the Living Dead, I feel like it would be more enjoyable to even watch now, Dawn, just because it's a little bit more action packed and more things happen, and the fact that they're in a mall helps add a lot of aspects and things that the other one doesn't have. Honestly, Day of the Dead, I don't remember it, so I can't say that I like that one, because I just don't really remember anything about it. But
Day of the Dead has always been my favorite. I think just because of the claustrophobia of it, and the tension and the kind of ethical questions that are raised with the scientist characters, and also you know, how the military essentially has to deal with some, like, developments that are discovered that are you know, kind of off the record or what have you. In that, I think there's a lot of interesting things going on with that, and it doesn't really get its due out of the Dead trilogy. It's usually, I think, generally speaking, it's probably considered the least favorable of those three.
I mean, yeah, I think that Day of the Dead doesn't get the recognition it deserves. It's my favorite at this point, and I think as I get older, I like Day of the Dead more and more. Especially just the environment of these people, like, because for the first time in Day of the Dead, the characters are sort of like, you know, and this is another brilliant thing about the Dead trilogy, is you don't know where the zombies come from, right? Like, there's one line in Night of the Living Dead where they say a satellite crashed to Earth and it brought radiation, but that's as close as you ever get to an explanation. And so in Day of the Dead, the characters are military people and scientists that are in this bunker in Florida, trying to figure out how to bring the world back or how to stop it. And it's also, it's clear that this has become like an academic project, because everybody is dead. Everything is dead. They're the only living people that exist within the range of their radios, right? Like, everything died. And they're still trying somehow to, like, hold on to the old world, to keep it alive, to figure something out. And the closest that they can get is bribing zombies with human flesh to, like, do tricks, basically. That's, like, what human civilization comes to in the end, is, like, recreational cannibalism. And I think that in this time of COVID-19, we all should watch Day of the Dead, and we should all be prepared for where we're going.
You're going to be homeless, though.
That's a very optimistic, a very positive note to conclude talking about Romero's Dead trilogy. Now, the original slate for this span of Romero's career that we were going to discuss ends in 1981 with Night Riders, which, to my knowledge, you guys haven't seen that. I watched it last night, and I was, I can't say I was really, you know, psyched to be tuning into that, because I was like, all right, it's a Renaissance Fair drama comedy, and it's 2.5 hours long. And there came a point at, like, the hour and a half mark of that movie where I'm like, oh, so this must be almost over. It seemed like all the characters arcs have, fulfilled themselves. And then I pull it up on the guide, and it says 1 hour and 27 minutes. So I still had a good hour left to go. But Night Riders, I actually found to be maybe Romero's. I would say it's in contention for Romero's strongest film. I would have to let that sit and marinate for a while. It was a surprise for me. Ed Harris is great as the protagonist of that film. And it's kind of like the all-star edition of all of Romero's 70s films. It's got like all the members of his Pennsylvania crew that pop up in Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead and Martin, and all these familiar faces round out the gang of misfits that lead this Renaissance fair. And I don't know. There's a lot of interesting questions that are raised. Typically, that's always the case with Romero about the battle of ideas and whether or not you should allow that to potentially handicap yourself, or to the point of death, even whether or not the idea is that valuable that it's worth a human life dying for. And I highly recommend it to you guys if you enjoy Romero, and especially if you dug Martin. I think obviously this is a very tonally different film, but it's closer to that than what I would imagine Season of the Witch and There's Always Vanilla to be.
Yeah.
At this point in his career, he's definitely a mature filmmaker. The next movie he goes on to make is Creepshow with Stephen King.
And that's an excellent movie.
That's a lot of fun.
I actually have seen Night Riders, but it was years and years ago, and I remember having a really, really positive experience of it. Is it available online right now?
Yeah, it's on Amazon Prime. Except,
okay, excellent.
Unless you live in Costa Rica, in which case you need NordVPN.
Okay, you get NordVPN, then you're okay.
Allegedly, that's what Hans at least believes. Night Riders, 1981. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you guys want to talk about Creepshow briefly, since we did a little bit on Day of the Dead, and we'll just close it out there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love Creepshow. It's definitely like, because there's a lot of horror anthology movies, right? And I don't know what you guys' opinion is on them is, but like, I generally think that horror anthology movies are terrible. I mean, Trilogy of Terror maybe like okay, but like Tales from the Dark Side, Necronomicon, even Creepshow 2, like they're lousy pictures. But you get to Creepshow and like it's got that perfect fucking tone. I love all the visual like EC Comics inspired effects and like borders. Like they'll actually put panel borders on the frame. They do that really like intense, like almost giallo lighting on like with certain like horror, like money shots. I love the creatures. I love the cast. I love Leslie fucking Nielsen is great in this movie.
Oh yeah.
It's to me it's one of those like when Halloween comes around, I always watch Creepshow. I watch Creepshow every October. That and Reanimator, which is like a whole different discussion. Rest in peace, Stuart Gordon.
I do think that Creepshow is probably the one anthology where there's not a specific weak link. I wouldn't go as far to say that most horror anthologies are total piles of shit, but it tends to be the case that there's maybe one or two really good ones, and then the rest are fair weather at best. Like the VHS series is the most recent example of that. VHS 1 and 2, I won't even talk about the third one because that's all terrible. But with VHS, the first film, there was maybe one good one that it concludes with. With VHS 2, it's about 50-50. And then if you go a little bit further back, like the only other one that is maybe as well-rounded as Creepshow, but is still, it doesn't have the sticking power that does, or the memorability that Creepshow does, is maybe John Carpenter's Body Bags. Which is
I've never
still...
seen that.
It's fun. There's only 3 of them in there. And John Carpenter directed 2 of them. Toby Hooper directed the last one. And I would say that they're all a good, solid 7 out of 10. Whereas Creepshow, with some of these, I think you're getting a 10 out of 10. Like they're all fun, or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. There's a lasting power to the stories and the iconography of these shorts, where immediately you think of Creepshow and these will come to mind.
Well, I think one of the things that sets Creepshow apart is like to me the only other horror anthology that I've seen, because I haven't seen Body Bags or VHS, and there's also like the Tales of Halloween is a new one that came out a couple of years ago that I've heard good things about, but I haven't seen.
Trick or Treat.
Trick or Treat, yeah. Also haven't seen, sadly, but it's Trilogy of Terror with Karen Black, which is like in my mind, it's actually got a better pedigree than Creepshow to a degree, not on the director's side, but because they're all based on short stories by Richard Matheson, who's, in my mind, like a much better writer than Stephen King. But Trilogy of Terror, it's like, and they all have Karen Black, which is kind of interesting that there's like the same person playing different roles in all of them. But like, I remember the Zuni fetish doll, and I don't remember a goddamn other thing that happens. Like the range in most horror anthologies is, I'd say, like every once in a while you'll get an 8 out of 10, and then the rest of it like kind of goes lower than that. And I think that the problem is that generally, like the different sections of the anthology, like Trilogy of Terror has this problem. They're all shot the same. They all kind of look the same. They all kind of feel the same. So even though you're getting different setups and different monsters and whatever, it all feels, samey. Whereas Creepshow, every segment is very distinct from every other segment, right? And the cast is totally different. The setup is totally different. Stephen King gives the best performance in the movie, weirdly. He's fucking amazing in that movie. And it's you were saying like, sometimes you're dealing with 10 out of 10s. I'd say the lowest that Creepshow ever goes is like 8 out of 10 with the bug sequence, maybe. But it's all killer, no filler in that movie. And then Creepshow 2 is such a piece of shit. Like when it's the kids on the fucking raft sticking a, like, you know what I'm talking about? That segment.
That's the only memorable segment from that movie too. And it's still just okay. As far as horror goes, that one's okay. I can't remember the 3 or 4 other segments of Creepshow 2.
Yeah, that's it. That's the best that you got is like the monster is like a bunch of trash bags in a swamp. That's the best thing that they have going. Meanwhile, Creepshow 1, you got the birthday cake head, you got the waterlogged Ted Danson zombie, you got the thing in the crate. Oh man, the thing in the crate. What a fucking great monster.
Well, I think the biggest difference with Creepshow and most of these other anthology movies is that they had fun with it. They just decided to make something fun. They cast people like Ted Danson and Leslie Nielsen, who you wouldn't put into something that it's to be taken serious, I guess. So the fact that they just had fun with it and everything is so creative and different from each other that it works better than something that is going to present something silly and trying to take it seriously. With this one, it actually feels like like a variety show or like a show where you get to see a lot of very different things that all work by themselves. And I feel like having a very varied cast like that with people that you wouldn't expect to have in a movie like this helps a lot.
Yeah, there is that level of talent there. But as far as them having fun with it, I think it might have something to do with the marketing as well, right? Because I wouldn't say that there are other anthologies where they weren't having fun with it. But I think it's all about how it's channeled and also how it's handled in the story, right? So with VHS 2, for example, there's a segment that has a documentarian going out and exploring this. I think it's a Malaysian death cult, right? And the whole VHS series is marketed as like this really dark, really creepy found footage series, right? And the conclusion of that death cult found footage ends with like a giant goat monster flying around and chasing after people, and it looks terrible and ridiculous. And they're clearly going over the top with it on purpose. And there are other segments that are like that, but that's not what you were sold up front. With Creepshow, you're in for that 1950s EC comic style of horror that's going to be lined up for you.
Yeah, and they do such a good job. Like there are movies that are literally based on Tales from the Crypt that do not nail the tone as well as Creepshow does. It's a really well done movie.
Totally agree. So that is that's George Romero's career, 19 '68 to 1983, I believe. We've covered a good half of his career, and I'll say, not to disrespect the man, but it's essentially downhill from there.
Yeah, sadly, this is true. But the guy changed world cinema at least once. He made some good pictures, and sadly, he's no longer with us. I got an opportunity to meet George Romero at a screening that the Alamo Drafthouse was doing down here several years ago. That's where I got my copy of Dawn of the Dead signed. And at the time, I was making movies. I was a young punk kid. I was in high school, and he gave me his home address so I could send him a copy of my zombie movie, Passion of the Christ 2, Night of the Living Christ. He was very nice about it. He was a very, very generous man. And, The Land of the Dead is not bad. And even if you're going to have a downward swing, he made some fucking great movies on the way,
Yeah, absolutely. Land of the Dead is definitely one that needs revisiting, if anybody has been kind of lukewarm on that. And I find the projects that he didn't wind up making, but was slated to for a while, to be very interesting. I had made a video a while back about his Resident Evil film when he was contracted to do that movie. I remember finding the script to that in the early aughts and reading that several times. It would have been so much better than what wound up happening with that horrible, horrible franchise.
Yeah, how did that have so much longevity? It makes no sense to me.
Well, it's that World War Z factor. It's just the spectacle of it. I'll say that the first Resident Evil movie is okay.
Are you telling me
not
that
Resident Evil?
You're not into crow zombies?
Not into what zombies? Crow zombies?
Crow. Is it crow? Yeah, crow.
It's crow, you foreigner.
The crows that are zombies all of a sudden eating people. I think they did that on the last one or one of the last ones. It's just...
Well, that was in the game, too. I love the games for PlayStation, so I was really disappointed with that first one. I think George Romero's version would have been much more accurate. He did direct the Japanese commercial for Resident Evil 2 with Brad Renfro and some actress who also is, I think, well known, back in 1998 or so. That's about the closest things ever came. He was also contracted to do a film version of Stephen King's The Stand back in the 1980s.
Oh, and that would have been amazing.
That would have been really interesting to see, I think. And then on the Dead series note, there was actually supposed to be a seventh Dead film that he wasn't going to direct. At that point, I think his health had declined too much, and he wouldn't have been able to carry that. But I guess he had written something, and it was going to be directed by a collaborator of his. But there has been nothing as far as updates go on that since Survival of the Dead came out probably 10 years ago.
Now, this might be a weird thing to say with a zombie property, but I hope that people just let it stay dead. Like, just leave the man alone. Like, we don't need any more. We don't need any more Joe Russo's pillaging his corpse. But
Well,
we'll see what happens.
What's the last decent zombie-like movie come out?
That's a good question.
There was a Japanese flick that came out last year that I've heard good things about. But I mean, I don't know if I just speaking for myself, like, the zombie idea has been so thoroughly polluted by this shitty fucking renaissance, quote unquote, that, like, I see zombie or of the dead in the title of a movie, I turn around, I look the other way, I move quickly. I don't focus on it,
Is it one cut?
I think the most.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Oh yeah, one cut of the dead. That's the one that I heard of. Yeah.
I've heard good things about that as well. I haven't seen it yet. But to my knowledge, the last zombie film or property that really wowed me in any way was probably the Spanish Rec series. But, I mean, you could even make the argument that those aren't really zombies. They're possessed people or they have rabies or something.
Yeah. I think it's a zombie movie if it's about, like, the horror of big crowds of people that are all, like, stupid.
Yeah.
So, that's why, in a way, all of these blockbuster movies are zombie movies.
Don Jolly, thank you for coming back on the show. Where can people find your work?
Yeah. So if you're not aware, I am the editor-in-chief of Encyclopedia.zone, which is the internet's premier home for literary shitposting. We got a new issue just out called The Quarantine Fun Zone, featuring comics, shitposts, and short stories and poems, all about the COVID-19 epidemic or about anything other than the COVID-19 epidemic. And I don't know when this is going to come out, but we got a new issue coming up in May. As well. So you can check that out at encyclopedia.zone or watch me on YouTube at youtube.com/DonJolly. Thank you so much for having me once again. It's always a pleasure.
It was a great chat, and that's been the show for this week. Hans, you have a Twitter memorial, so people go to Hans Memorial on Twitter.
I do?
Follow Hans.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go follow that. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention before we close this zombie thing. Did you guys ever hear about Town of the Living Dead?
Town of the Living Dead?
Okay, so Town of the Living Dead, it's actually pretty far, or it was funny when it came out. I don't know if it holds up. It's from 2014. I think it's like a fake reality show of this Alabama town and this group of independent filmmakers that are trying to make a zombie movie that's taken them 6 years. And I don't remember exactly if it's, it's unscripted. Okay, so it's unscripted, but it's very charming because it's just a bunch of rednecks trying to make a zombie movie and they have no idea how to make it. And in each episode, it's just them trying to figure out how to do something decent, and it just looks like shit. So if you guys want to have a laugh and just watch something that's zombie related, that's not serious at all, Town of the Living Dead is definitely something that I would recommend when it came out in 2014. So don't hold me to that because I haven't seen it since then, but I remember enjoying it a lot. So check that one out.